Welcome everybody to the common room at the IHR in London. I'm Jo Fox, I'm the former director of the Institute, and I'd like to say a few words of welcome before we turn to our main event today, our panel. I turn to a promising topic, a postgraduate school of historical research in London. And here, the stars in their courses have fought in our favour. Albert Pollard, in his inaugural lecture at University College London in 1903. 15 years later, after much campaigning, fundraising and lobbying, and thanks to a critical donation by Cecil Power, among many others, the Institute of Historical Research was launched at 12 noon on the 8th of July, 1921. 100 years ago today, almost to the hour, and I have the invite to the opening ceremony here in front of me. Well, Pollard envisaged a historical laboratory, a hub for innovative, disruptive thinking where new knowledge could be created and ideas shared. Located in the heart of London, but reaching out across the UK and then internationally, initially across the Atlantic, Pollard was keen that the Institute not only have a home here in London, but reached out across the world. And Pollard was very much in keeping with the new internationalism that had developed after the First World War. The foundation of the Institute, like many contemporary organizations, was predicated on the belief that a deep, connected understanding of history could inform policy and serve society, and in doing so could point to our common humanity. If Pollard's vision resonated then, surely it continues to have meaning now. History informs and speaks to the most pressing challenges of our time: climate change to health, social injustice to globalization, human rights to mass migration, and of course, the pandemic with which we've all been living in the past months. I imagine that Pollard might have been impressed by the History and Policy Initiative that recently returned to the IHR. Pollard's vision of institutes of advanced study at the heart of the University of London remain today, and the IHR is fortunate to be located in an interdisciplinary school of advanced study. Interdisciplinary thinking can bring together expertise to create new ways of knowing. This was a fact acknowledged by Eileen Power, a pioneering female historian who now rightfully finds a place on the famous staircase in our building, alongside other female pioneers and directors of the Institute. She's finally acknowledged there for the work that she and others did to lay the foundations for the rest of us as a scholar and as a pathfinder. And one of the many fellowships that find a home here for early career researchers at the Institute rightly honours her memory. Power's inaugural address championed history's ability to cut across disciplinary divides because of its essentially comparative nature, and she spoke eloquently of history's importance to understanding the present, like Pollard. Her observations then remain true for historians today. And Power also frequently came to the Institute, in part because it was then and continues to be a site for the collision of ideas. Maxine Berg, Power's biographer, pointed to the IHR's role in providing a home for early networks for historians, with the first conferences of the Economic History Society held here, in Berg's words, because it was a simple venue which people could afford and where they could easily talk to each other. And these were among the reasons why the Institute built up such a rich and varied programme of seminars, a programme that remains at the heart of the IHR's operations today. Then, sitting round a table, pulling primary sources from the shelves to inform discussion and debate. Now, reaching out, as we're doing today, across the UK and internationally online. Pollard's vision also had a distinct sense of place and locality. His initial idea was to become home too for the history of London, an idea that found its legacy here in the Centre for Metropolitan History, in the Layers of London project, and now in the Centre for People, Place and Community, which consolidates this urban focus with the Victoria County history, which has been housed at the IHR since the Institute's earliest days and remains one of the longest running historical research projects in the UK. Local history collections were among the very first donations to the fledgling Institute Library, although its holdings have grown considerably from its 3,500 volumes and pamphlets in 1921 to 200,000 volumes now, with even more digital collections. And the Institute has certainly engaged with the digital world. The IHR was a pioneer in this area. It led internet data training courses in the 1990s, and its flagship initiatives of British History Online and the Bibliography of British and Irish History continue to evolve. Its training of the next generation of researchers in critical digital methods will, I know, prove invaluable. And historians will no doubt want to continue to engage in new digital methods, but we do so mindful of what it means to be human and how we might preserve the human in this, the machine age. Above all, the Institute's story has been and continues to be about the people who have read, trained, debated, and worked here. Reading through the list of those who've passed through the Institute's door is absolutely extraordinary, and some of them even left their mark. Mark Bloch inscribing one of the volumes in the library. If you ever come in to the building again, please ask one of the librarians to show it to you. It was one of the most magical moments of my time here. The social life too of the Institute was legendary, with much activity taking place in this common room, including, perhaps unusually, training for historians to take part in the university union dances in the 1930s. Historians were concerned then about their ability to dance, but, quote, guided by competent tutors and good music, it is to be hoped that a fresh descent upon the union dance floor may be planned. History is critical to an understanding of both our common humanity, but also our diverse pasts and identities. And this has become a critical focus for the Institute and the vast array of historical subfields and historians it represents. And the Institute is needed now more than ever, providing leadership in the discipline, working with our partners and those we serve, and advocating for the importance of history and of the arts and humanities more broadly. This at a time where in some quarters our relevance to the world of today is being brought into question. I'm sure that all of us here know that this claim is without merit, but we need, again, to make the case clearly, convincingly, positively, and loudly. And this is why we need an Institute of Historical Research now. It was an extraordinary privilege to serve as the Institute's first female director and to take a small place behind a long line of distinguished and pioneering historians who have occupied that role from Pollard onwards. And I know that under its new director, Claire Langhammer, the Institute will go from strength to strength as it enters its new century, true to its origins, but with a confident and determinedly modern outlook, just as Pollard would have wanted. And it now falls to me to introduce this morning's chair, Dr. Diya Gupta, the past and present fellow in race, ethnicity and equality in history. And it's been a pleasure to work with you here at the Institute, Diya. Diya is a literary and cultural historian focused on the intersections between life writing, visual culture and literature, particularly in response to war. At the IHR, Diya is working on her first book, based on her recently concluded doctoral research on Indian experiences in the literature of the Second World War. And she's also developing a fascinating project on hunger, violence, and empathy, which will investigate literary and visual representations of hunger in colonized India, in particular the Bengal famine of 1943. Dia, over to you, and to the IHR, a very, very happy birthday.
Thank you so much for that, Jo. That was a fantastic introduction to the history of the IHR and such a warm welcome for the first panel. And I'm sure everybody in the audience, you can't hear them clapping, but I can see a few hands, a few yellow hands raised in applause. Thank you so much for that introduction. A very warm welcome to everyone today. I am absolutely delighted to be chairing the first panel for the IHR's Global Birthday event. Before we begin, however, we do have another very special message to present to everybody. And this is via video. And this is from the IHR's centenary patron, Professor Mary Beard.
Hello, this is Mary Beard, and I'm very pleased to be here to offer the IHR very best wishes for its 100th birthday and many more of them to come. Because I think, and I realise I'm preaching to the converted a bit here, I think that history is going to prove more necessary, more useful and more important over the next 100 years. That's not because it's going to offer any off-the-peg solutions to the problems of the day, but increasingly, I think, we'll see that history can help us think differently about ourselves, can offer a different perspective on our world, can help us see ourselves from the outside, sort of turn us into anthropologists of our own present day. History is going to be about the future as much as it is about the past. So here's to the IHR's bicentenary. Happy birthday.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful message from Professor Mary Beard. And on the note that history is about the future as much as it is about the past, let's move on to our first panel discussion. Today's first session, I'm delighted to say, has distinguished speakers from Australia, Japan, Korea, and India. So we will begin by asking our panelists to introduce themselves and to reflect a little bit on the general condition of the discipline of history in their country. And then we will go on to ask them what they think the challenges and opportunities of history are that lie ahead of us, and what role perhaps an institute like the IHR might play in this. So moving on, I'm delighted to introduce our first panelist today, who is Professor Sandra Wilson. So Professor Wilson is Academic Chair of History, Philosophy and Sociology at Murdoch University, Perth in Australia. She's a historian of modern Japan. Her major research areas are Japanese politics and society in the 1930s and 40s, the history of Japanese nationalism, and Japanese war crimes and allied trials of suspected Japanese war criminals after the Second World War. So Sandra, if you wouldn't mind turning your camera on, turning your mic on, and telling us a little bit about yourself and what you see the discipline of history in Australia being.
Thank you, Dia. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hear you.
And thank you very much for this invitation to join you today. As you've said, I'm a historian of Japan. I work on topics from the 1930s to about the 1970s at the moment. And my current research is about Japanese war crimes and why they were committed. So I'd like to say a few things about what I see as the state of the discipline of history in Australia. I've picked on what I think the challenges or the current difficulties are more than anything, because they do tend to be uppermost in our minds at the moment. And I have 4 topics that I'd like to mention. One is that our biggest problem, I'm sure I am not alone in this group in saying so, is underfunding. I bet that everybody would say this. And by that, I don't just mean underfunding of whole departments or other workplaces, but a kind of a chronic underfunding in a lack of recognition of what is required to do the work of history properly, whether we're talking about teaching or research. And that is a problem that affects our working lives in every respect. Another point has to do with the areas that are cognate with us. I think that two specific disciplines with whom we used to have quite a lot in common have drawn away for various reasons. One is politics, which used to have a strong historical interest typically, and with whom we used to work fairly closely. I remember in my undergraduate days that the double major in politics and history was a standard one. Politics seems to have more or less abandoned its interest in the past, which from our point of view is a pity. I mean politics as an academic discipline. And the other is cultural studies, which started off with, I think, great intellectual power and empirical rigor, but has more or less abandoned that rigor and gone what I would call soft and mushy. There are various consequences of this kind of drawing away of the cognate disciplines. For example, fewer opportunities for cross-disciplinary teaching, and also our colleagues are less likely to support staffing in history, frankly, because of their lessened interest in matters of the past or in the discipline of history. In Australia, I would say that another difficulty is that our major professional body has narrowed its interests to an overwhelming focus on Australian history. I speak as someone who doesn't do Australian history. So that narrowed focus does tend to leave historians of other places fairly isolated. And my last point would be that in public history, but also in academic history, the conception of history has somewhat narrowed to mean heritage and memorialization. An awful lot of what historians do and people who talk about history do is to memorialize the past or to concentrate on matters of heritage. So, for example, I work at the moment on the Second World War. I would think the majority of studies of the Second World War are about memory. Memory is a great historical field. It's been a very stimulating one and a very useful one, but to work exclusively on memorialization overlooks a whole lot of stuff that just hasn't been done on, in this case, the Second World War itself. And I think this tendency to do history as either memorialization or heritage promotes a kind of a selective focus on vivid moments, striking memorials, important points of the past without really looking at context, which is what I think historians do more than anything else, examine context and use context to explain things. It can also lead to the kind of history that's really, as one of my colleagues who I think is here said, national memory at prayer, rather than anything with intellectual rigor. And that seems to me to be a pity and something that we have to challenge and something that we have to fight against mostly through doing good work. Thank you. I'll pass on to the next person.
Thank you so much for that, Sandra. That's some really important and relevant points, and I'm sure that will resonate with our other speakers as well. So we'll find out shortly. So I'm delighted to introduce our second panelist to you, Professor Shigeru Akita, who is Professor of British Imperial History and Global History at Osaka University in Japan. His research is on the economic international order of Asia in the 19th and 20th centuries and their connections with the British Empire. Recently, his research has included global history from Asian perspectives. So Shigeru, I can see you've got your camera on and you're unmuted. If you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and the state of the discipline of history in Japan. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, dear. Thank you very much. And on behalf of many Japanese scholars who received great benefit from IHR, I would definitely express our thanks to IHR for their strong support for our studies in the Great Britain, UK. And I'm now doing the new field of the global history in Japan. So today I'd like to first to report about two trends about historical studies in Japan. One is, of course, our national history. It means that Japanese history, fortunately, still continue to attract many graduate students and undergraduate. So the national history is still very popular. But in addition to such kind of traditional so-called traditions, nowadays, the new field of the so-called world history or global history tend to attract the strong interest and the strong, maybe the encouragement from founding agency as well as from universities. And for example, the Osaka University had established de facto research center of global history around 5 years ago. And since then, our group received some substantial money from university as well as from JSPS for the further development of global history. So it means that, of course, since Meiji period, the Japanese academic circle, within Japanese academic circles, we have so-called traditional tripartite division of labor. It means national Japanese history, and the other is Western history, and also the Asian history or the Oriental history. This is a traditional tripartite division of labor. But nowadays, combined with these and overcome the barriers of 3 divisions, we try to create one combined research field of the world history. But in your case, I call it global history. But of course, nowadays, the global history became very popular in the world. But some Japanese scholars intensively try to present and create so-called Asian perspectives on global and world history and try to make very constructive and stimulating dialogue with Europeans and American scholars. This is one important phenomena. And the second point is related to our implication to the society. Because from next year, Education Ministry try to introduce new compulsory teaching subject as a field of the so-called senior high school levels. They call it integrated history because since the end of the Second World War, for last 70 years, the Japanese Education Ministry established 2 teaching subjects. One is Japanese history, the other is world history. So these 2 subjects completely separate for last 70 years. But due to the rapid speed of globalization, such kind of 2 division as a teaching level as a senior secondary school levels is not suitable for the future to global citizens, younger generations. So they try to introduce 2 subjects together, combine the Japanese history also with world history, and try to create the new so-called teaching subject entitled the integrated history. And for last 3 years, many Japanese historians, including myself, try to write new and quite innovative textbook for the younger generations. So it means such kind of the new subject, probably introduction of the new subject will give great encouragement for the professional historians to think the new perspectives. That's the second point. Yeah, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Shigeru. It's fascinating to hear how your global history is changing in Japan and kind of seeing new ways into Japanese history, as well as coming up with new perspectives, Asian perspectives on global history. So maybe we can talk about that a bit more when we go on to our discussion stage. So I'm now delighted to introduce our 3rd panelist. This is Professor Shimsu from the Department of History in Honsei University in South Korea. She was a researcher at the IHR, so she's very familiar with the institute. before she went on to do postdoctoral work at Seoul National University. Since then, Hye-shim has been Vice Dean and Chair at Honsei University, and she has published numerous books, including her most recent work called The History of Consumption, and this won an award by the Korean government. So Hye-shim, over to you.
Hello. Hello, thank you for having me. Hello from Seoul, South Korea. I have to make a little correction. I saw Professor Maxim Berg's name in participant. I'm great honor to see her through this online. She was my heroine because, I got a lot of inspiration from her book. But my most recent book is The Global History of Ginseng, the plant that embodied multiple world system. It just came out last year. And then in one month, I'm publishing another book, reading Agatha Christie. So as you see from my vita, you can probably tell that my interest has been kind of expanding from 16th, 17th century England to modern global phenomenon. So I kind of want to add that. Now I want to discuss about the state of discipline area in discipline in Korea. In Korea, historical studies are divided into 3 disciplines: Korean history, the majority, and the Asian history and Western history. Western history is kind of minor, like approximately 200 PhD, which occupy 1/7 of all historians. And the Western history mostly focus on like great powers like Germany and France and Britain. So there is no clear geographical definition of Asia or the West, and Asian history mainly deals with China and Japan, and the Western history tend to focusing on only these 5 nations. So unfortunately, the large part of the globe remained practically as the empty spaces in historical studies in Korea. Now I will briefly overview the development of the Western history in Korea for last 100 years. In fact, this year marks Korea's centenary of introducing Western history into university curriculum. So it's a kind of meaningful year for Koreans too. The first generation of scholars, they went through Japanese occupation and liberation and Korean War, and then aftermath and reconstruction. In this stage, powerful Western nations such as Britain was the role model to Korea. And Korean academia choose liberal democracy and capitalist model of modernization. And in this context, bourgeois revolution, such as like British Civil War and the nation state, those topics emerged as the important subject to study. But second stage, which started in early 1960s, it was harsh military regime. Military dictatorship Korean scholars hated, so they faced with the gap between ideal and reality. So while there was a general consensus on the industrialization and modernization, Korean intellectuals vehemently opposed the political system of military regime. Therefore, Korean academia paid strong attention to the subject of class conflict, such as the labor movement or the popular uprisings. Also, the transition from feudalism to capitalism became a hot issue. So the second generation of Western history in Korea could be identified as the era of duality, where scholars supported the capitalism, the base in Marxist terminology, but despised the apparatus of politics, the superstructure. Finally, the third generation. In the late 1990s, with the importations of postmodernism, Western history in Korea became fragmented. A variety of subjects and new perspectives, such as new cultural history, post-colonialism, transnational, multiculturalism emerged. At the same time, traditional political and economic history and ancient and medieval history rapidly waned. And currently, feminist history also are on the ebb. So from 5 years ago, a large number of historians who were the pillar of Korean Western history began to retire. So the age of great historians is over. I have one last comment on the current state of historical discipline in Korea. That is, the subject of study tend to get swung by political agenda of government. Agendas such as consilience or conversion, or futurism, or fourth industrial revolution, those agendas are pushed by Korean research foundations. So I will sum up here. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Shim. That was very fascinating. Thank you. And I'm sure with regards to government agendas and political interference, there'll be a lot more of that in our discussion. I'm now delighted to introduce our fourth and final panelist, who is Professor Tonika Sarkar. I hope she's been able to join us. I think I saw that she's managed to get on the Zoom call. Professor Sarkar is Emeritus Professor of History at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. Her work focuses on the intersections of religion, gender, and politics in both colonial and post-colonial South Asia. Her most recent research has looked at the rise of the Hindu right in India, in particular its impact upon women. So Professor Sarkar, if you wouldn't mind putting your camera on and putting your mic on and speaking a little bit about yourself and the state of the discipline of history in South Asia.
Thank you, Dia, for having me here, and heartiest congratulations to IHR for completing a wonderful century, and looking forward to many, many more such to come. It's a great privilege to be here and to listen to my predecessors just now. Very quickly, if we start with the historiographical problems of the state of the art in our country, in India, and I can only speak for or about the modern period. By modern period, we more often than not mean the colonial period, and we don't go beyond that very much, unfortunately. There was a very long period when the focus was completely, entirely on anti-colonial struggles. And initially, till the late 80s, it was on the great nationalist leaders of various hues. And in a way, that trend is coming back again for a variety of reasons. From the late 80s, under the aegis of the Subaltern Studies School of History, there was a shift in emphasis. Anti-colonial struggles remained the focus, but now the gaze shifted to peasants and tribals mostly. But their struggles beyond anti-colonial ones were not considered that seriously. Even our economic histories, where Marxists predominated, looked mostly at the depredations that colonial rule wreaked on Indians in India. Fortunately, from late 90s, there is an expansion in our horizon, quite a remarkable expansion in our horizon. And there's the experiences and agency of women, factory workers, tribals, artisans, low castes. All of that are coming in, especially law, labor, environmental histories of rivers and forests and cities, local histories of cities and so on, and the cultural sphere. These are coming in. After a long stint in the 90s, in between, of post-colonialism, which was a very important development, but which restricted again our gaze to what colonial rule did to our self-image and to our relationship with the world, to our culture, and to our sense of identity. So now recently there has been an important opening up. Histories of war, for instance, Indians in the First and Second World Wars, etc. There are certain problems still. I won't mention underfunding, because you can assume that for a country where even literacy is hard to come by, there would be underfunding for higher research. And it's remarkable how Indian historians have managed to produce pretty good work, I must say, despite that, and working largely in public universities where, compared to private universities, all the resources are very, very meager. But the problem has been that we are too inward looking. We have always been too inward looking in our teaching and in our research. Indian history has been absolutely, the boundary of our engagement with the subject. And for instance, I'm right now writing a book, commissioned to write a book on gender in the Indian subcontinent. And I'm struggling to find books and primary material on Pakistan and Bangladesh, for instance. There's absolutely nothing. And even when you are working on your own history, you have to keep your mind alive by reading around, actually by delving into the wonderful work that is going on elsewhere. And that's, a little bit of Western history does come in, global history does come in, but the rest of the world, Africa, Southeast Asia, Middle East, they are just areas of darkness for historians, let's say. And International Relations Department is the only place where our students go to pick some sort of understanding of these places from. So that's one very important gap. Primary and secondary material being very, very difficult to acquire on these larger histories and larger spaces. Secondly, cross-disciplinary research is largely absent. And the diversity of historical experiences, again, eludes us. We have no standard of comparison to assess our own standing by. Post-colonial historiography, which in a sense still governs our perspective for the colonial and post-colonial periods, has enriched us enormously. We are all post-colonial historians in a way. But post-colonialism has tended to read modern Indian historical processes as entirely shaped by or as effects of colonial misgovernance. It is therefore state-focused, and the state, moreover, the colonial state, is seen as a homogeneous whole. My research, however, convinces me that there was indeed considerable amount of autonomous Indian agency, for better or for worse, though never in total isolation from colonial interventions. Moreover, post-colonial perspectives have heaped their critical faculties on colonialism, and that tends to ascribe, willingly or unwillingly, a certain innocence to Indian culture. All cultures have their dark holes, but black holes, but we haven't really focused enough on that. And if I want to do that, I've often been accused of being a neo-Orientalist, which is the kiss of death for any South Asian historian. So some problems of sources. I forgot to mention something. Our history stops at 1947. Really, a huge wall comes up there. History comes to a full stop there because our archives do not allow us any access to post-independence material. Okay, so that's yet another great impediment in expanding our horizons. So again, willingly or unwillingly, we tend to look at our post-colonial history as entirely an effect of what the colonial state had left us. And finally, this is very unpleasant to talk about. The political situation is becoming, absolutely antithetical to serious, critical, independent historical research. Many of our brightest students are incarcerated in prisons. Many of our brightest faculty members have been pulled in for questioning. Some of them have indeed, faced arrests and so on. And the government has developed its own research agenda, which is, as Sandra Wilson said just now, really making history into a heritage study and a national heritage, which we are duty bound to honor in its entirety. So in that context, I don't know how long our world of history can survive, or the world of colonial and post-colonial histories can survive without major damage. Thank you.
Thank you, Tonikati. That's wonderful. That was very rich, enlightening, and also drew upon darker notes of the hazards, perhaps, of practicing history in India today under certain political conditions. There's clearly been a lot of resonances, I think, between our four speakers and what you've sort of foregrounded as the state of the discipline in your different countries. We're going to go around the table again, and I want to add here that if anyone wants to respond to what another panelist has said, please feel free to do so when I ask you to speak. So I think we've touched a little bit, certainly in Sandra and Tonika's talk, on the challenges, some very serious challenges of doing history in the 21st century. But perhaps, considering that we can look into the future as well, we can perhaps think a little bit about the opportunities that might present themselves in doing history in new ways. And so maybe on that note, we'll go around the table again and get your thoughts about these new ways of doing history and the opportunities that might lie there. So Sandra, perhaps we'll start with you. So over to you.
Well, I do think there are new opportunities despite the challenges that we all face. And one of them is perhaps a greater opportunity than ever before for historians, and including postgraduate students and young historians, to engage in public debate. Many of us have said that we think that history can and should inform public debate, that it has things to say about the present and the future. I think that with the proliferation of relatively accessible but still respectable internet sources, it is easier for people to have a say, to have it immediately. Some of my students are doing this with great effect, I think. Being able to bring a historical perspective to the issues of the day in short, pithy form, but informed by their historical perspectives. And I find that very encouraging. So, for example, at the moment, we have an inquiry going on. It's an inquiry, it's actually a defamation suit at the moment, I think. Anyway, a lot of things going on to do with Australian war crimes in Afghanistan. This is an area that, war crimes, an area that I work on, that some of my students work on. It's been a good opportunity for them to put some historical perspectives into the public sphere, and I find that quite encouraging.
That's great. Thank you. That's really interesting that something that's so current and live can be informed by historical debate. Thank you for that, Sandra. So if we go on,
danger to the students, I might say, because it's a heated issue. So they do put themselves in the firing line by doing it, but that is also a good thing. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Perhaps we can call upon Professor Shigeru Akita now for his perspective on some of the opportunities ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. So that's a very big question for me, but I think two things I pointed out. One is maybe the collaboration with brilliant many school teachers and journalists in order to show our presence and our historical studies. For example, for last over 15 years, the Osaka scholars, my colleague, intensively collaborate with the brilliant, excellent senior high school teachers to discuss about especially the contents of the teaching contents at senior high school, but that contents, of course, closely related to the university's the historical contents. And for around 5 years, we published the new book entitled The World History for Global Citizens. But unfortunately published in Japanese. But that book became very popular, even for the younger generation, and heavily and widely propagated to by the national newspapers. And so our attempt attract much attention from many people and try to show the usefulness and our sometimes social contribution made by historians to the wider society. So that is one example. And the second point is that now we are facing in the middle of the so-called pandemic, but to break this kind of difficult situation, we started to collaborate with European, American, Asian scholars by opening our seminars through the Zoom and media ways. And so it means it is very easy for each of us, for both sides, to broaden our perspective very easily and to communicate with several excellent top scholars about our common theme. Of course, sometimes we can invite some of the politicians or the journalists as a speaker. So I think such kind of the new so-called method by using the Zoom, some other so-called new latest technique is very helpful to broaden our perspectives and to show our presence. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Shigeru. So I think from Sandra and Shigeru, we talked a bit about history and public debate. With Shigeru, we talked a bit about sort of history and the importance of collaboration with people outside your field, with school teachers, with journalists. So we'll talk to Shimsu now and ask her for her perspectives on opportunities ahead.
I will mainly focus on challenges ahead. I feel very sad, but I don't see any optimistic sign at the moment. So mostly Korean situation, but some of them are global. So number one, the challenges ahead. Number one is population decline. Korea presently marks #1 country in population decline, which leads to downsize the universities and eventually the decreasing number of graduate students. And I believe this is a major threat. Secondly, it is getting very hard. It is getting harder for history PhDs to find a job in Korea, which is mainly caused by the unbalanced endorsement of scholarship between the humanities and science. This situation is very discouraging to potential graduate students. Number three, there is a growing demand for generalists in society, not the specialists, and the field of history is no exception. This phenomenon is closely related with the decline of general literacy in younger generation, which I believe is caused by widespread of smartphone and social network system. I think this is a global phenomenon, and people are no longer able to read something long or abstract, let alone complicated argument. So even if we produce some excellent scholarship, there is not enough readership to appreciate it. So that's a major threat, I think. Fourth, Western history is no longer as popular as before in Korea. European history functioned as a role model for a long time, but with Korea's economic development and the introduction of post-colonialism, those era is gone. Also, neo-nationalism and far-right mood play a part in losing interest in Western history. So people like me do not have many opportunities. Fifth, as we all know that the digitalization enormously helps students to conduct research, but there are downsides. I suspect that this digitalization produce a kind of sort of dilemma, the embarrassment of the riches. So researchers often forget the preciousness of the document, and they often do not look into them thoroughly. And the hardship of learning and pleasure of archival research, those are all gone. And students hardly experience in person the physical and material aspect of primary sources, which is very sad. Lastly, as we all know, the people consume historical contents every day. But the popular platform, such as YouTube, is mostly run by amateur or entertainers, not by knowledgeable historians. And in this new platform, visual aspect is so much emphasized, which often lead to omit the complicated narrative and intertextuality. Also, the distortion, strange boiling down, and even theft in copyright constantly occur. But it is very difficult to regulate these transgressions at the moment, and making a competing content seems too cheap to us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Hiyashim. You focused a lot on the challenges, and I was wondering there when you talked about, say the sphere of YouTube and historians not being in charge of that sort of content, whether then an opportunity is for historians to enter more in those spaces, digital spaces, and influence the content that so many younger people see. So just a thought out there. So turning to our fourth and final panelist, Professor Tonika Sarkar, please, for your thoughts on opportunities.
Thank you. On opportunities, yes. Though, Professor Sui did mention a lot of the things that I also experience in the Indian context, so I won't, repeat them. Yes, historical research, as I said, expanded enormously and became richer and richer in the last 2 decades. And the resonances are still very strong. But the enrichment was done only in certain very, very, privileged metropolitan institutions, universities, let's say. It didn't expand beyond that. So that's a major problem. We write, or Indian historians by and large may write very good histories, but there is, as she said, not enough readership for that. And at a parallel level, an extremely amateurish and tendentious history passes off as a true account of the past. Secondly, yes, internet resources are a huge help, and students generally prove extremely deft at handling them, but they still more or less give us access to published government documents. And private papers, old newspapers, old pamphlets, tracts, confidential government sources like police department sources, etc., they are not available. And nothing is available as archival resources for the post-colonial period. So those problems still remain. And even to expand our horizon of secondary readings, to see what's going on in other areas, in other spaces, you need to browse in libraries, you need to handle books, I think, and, to see what resonates with you and what is not that important. So that's a problem that remains. Despite that, a lot of new avenues have indeed opened up, cutting across boundaries within the historical discipline. Like, one uses archival material with oral histories whenever they are, available, does a bit of ethnographic research to understand a locale or a tradition. There's far more of stress on the movement, migration, global migration, internal migration, partitions in other areas, movements of commodities and ideas and people across the globe, war and so on, epidemics, pandemics, medicine, which are actually global developments. You can't, keep India or study Indian history in these areas in isolation from global development. So that has happened, that's still going on. And as I said, the enrichment of history has left strong resonances, but within a limited circle of researchers, teachers, and students. And I would say it was our problem that we did not take into account the larger world of history that, remain outside our control, let's say, or intervention.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Sharkar. I think those are really valuable and important points, and I think resonate quite a bit with what Professor Akita was saying as well, in terms of pushing for more global understandings of history. And in some ways, I think this panel being held on the IHR's centenary on its birthday is an attempt to push towards more collaboration, more networks, and more ways of doing global history. I would like to ask you, how you think an institute like the IHR might be able to help with some of the opportunities. But I think before I steal all your time, I should open up the floor to audience questions. So if anyone has a question, you can raise your hand and I will invite you to say your question out loud. Or if you prefer, you can just raise your hand, you can just put it in the chat. So Maxine, yes, please do ask your question, unmute yourself, please.
Just a minute, sorry. Thank you. I have really enjoyed this discussion. It was really great to see Shigeru again and to hear Hijiro. It was really, and I haven't met Sandra before, but very interesting on Japan. A question I have for all the panelists is, do you have any response to the new interest that is becoming very important, particularly in US universities, but it is also appearing in Britain, and that's in the new history of capitalism. So in the US, it has been very much focused on the study of the impact of slavery on wealth in the US. It has been a very US focused history. So it's interesting to compare it to global history. But there are many wider issues that it's connected with, and particularly inequality, the emergence of the new labor history. There are many new fields opening up, but we are now in history departments where there are virtually no economic historians. And it does seem to me that these fields, these areas that young historians are now interested in, they do need a background in some aspect of economic history. But economic history, as it developed in recent decades, became inaccessible, became centered in economics departments. And that has been a real tragedy. But it has also meant that history departments, instead of offering some kind of alternative, just really abandon the field. So I don't know, I think it would be very interesting to have your perspectives on these new interests and new demands, but our inability now in our department, in many of our departments, to provide the training and the background in order to pursue those interests. Okay, thank you very much.
Who would like to respond to Maxine first? Hijiro, please go ahead.
I totally agree with you, Maxine. It's so nice to see you, by the way. My university, Yonsei University, is second biggest university in Korea. And then we have a really large business school. Economics department are the number one department, economic department, number one. And there is only one economic historian left, and he's going to retire in a year. And then there is zero non-economic historian in history department. So I totally agree with you. But students, they kind of tend to avoid economic, political history, and nowadays intellectual history too. They only wanna do the cultural, transnational. There's not much I can do.
How about Sandra or Tonika or Shigeru? Would you like to respond to Maxine?
Yeah, I can respond quickly. Yeah, so
Sure.
Maxine, thank you very much. Very interesting the question. And I also agree. And I had read to your Giorgio's article about appeared in Journal of Global History about the historical development of new capitalism. And but from my reading, maybe he's very too critical about the authors, the of Harvard. I know that author very well, but you mentioned the development of new capitalism arguments. It was closely related, as you mentioned, the recovery of the economic history studies, and in Japan. We also have the economic history became one of the pioneers, as you mentioned, the so-called wider meaning of global history studies to broaden our perspectives. And of course, in Japanese universities, the economic history usually belong to the Faculty of Economics or Graduate School of the Economics, but graduate school of the humanities, our historian also, we can easily still continue to collaborate with them to show the importance of the so-called historical studies. So it means such kind of collaboration beyond the borders of the faculties is still very important, very important. So I'm very optimistic about such kind, you have mentioned that such kind of revival of the economic history for further broaden our perspectives. Yeah.
Thank you, Shigeru. Sandra, do you have any thoughts on economic history?
No, just to say I agree with Maxine. It's also a problem in Australian universities, the sad disappearance of economic history. I think it's a big problem. And I am encouraged to hear that Professor Akita foresees a revival. Good. I look forward to it.
Thank you for that, Sandra. Professor Sharkar, any thoughts on economic history?
It's in a state of crisis, I would say, and new histories of capitalism are not forthcoming. We had a rich debate in the 1970s about the transition to capitalism from feudalism and so on, but the stress was always more on feudalism rather than on capitalism. And that has not been taken up by historians, except, a number of labor historians, Indian labor historians, do train themselves in economic history. And that reflects, even if they're not working on economic history per se, it is reflected in their work. That kind of training is reflected in their work.
Thank you very much. So we have, moving on to other questions, we don't have a question, we have a comment from Paul O'Kane. Paul, I wonder if you want to read your comment out loud, because it's quite an interesting one.
Oh, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Yeah, I didn't really mean to speak. I just wanted to put my comment in, but I'll read it out if you want, if it makes a difference.
Sure.
So yeah, I'm writing a book on history and contemporary art. One of the artists that I'm interested in is a German artist named Thomas Demand. And as a result, I've just found a post-it note that simply says the words demand history. But having heard the panel, I thought that this might now be adopted as a new global political slogan: demand history. Sorry, it's not a question. Thank you.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. I thought the fact that demanding history should be the slogan of our panel is a really important one. Are there other questions? Please do raise your hands or put them in the chat. Otherwise, I'm happy to ask some myself. Okay, we have a question from Keith Flett. Keith, would you like to read out your question, or unmute yourself and read out your question, or I can read it out? Keith asks, is history from below still a way of opening up historical interest and research to a wider layer of people outside the academy? And I think this is to all the panelists. So is history from below still a way of opening up historical interest and research to a wider layer of people outside the academy? So who would like to address this first?
I'll have a go.
Sandra, go ahead.
Oh, Tonika. Sorry. Yes, I think it is a way to interest people in history outside the academy. I think it has that function quite strongly. Within the academy, it's become a bit more fossilized, I think, history from below. My own view is that people who focus strongly on history from below need a bit more history from above. You know, that it tends to become, it fetishizes certain types of sources and approaches without adequately considering the interplay between policy and the bits below. So it becomes a bit lopsided the other way. But as far as opening up historical interest in a wider community, I think it has great potential still. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Tonika, I wonder if we could have your thoughts next. You're still on mute, by the way, Tonika. Yes,
Thank
perfect.
you, Professor Burke, for your comment. Yes, histories from below have been a very important trend in our historical culture since the 1980s. But as I said, it has emanated from very limited, points, and the problem is how to disseminate it, how to make it attractive and convincing for a larger circle of students who have practically no access to books, who are not told to what to look for through internet, who can't even possibly access the internet very effectively, how to take it to them. And here, and this is an area I've been working on a bit, what would I say, right-wing historians have had a head start, writing popular histories and, teaching them endlessly through multiple fora. And it's very, very difficult now for us to compete. And academic histories, given the level of historical understanding in the country as a whole, will not stand up to that challenge as yet, unless we can think of far more creative ways of popularizing real history, responsible history, among, let's say, vernacular historians.
Thank you for that, Professor Sharkar. Really important words. Responsible history. I wonder if Shigeru, do you want to comment on histories from below at all? You're on mute as well. So Shigeru, if you could unmute yourself, please. Thank you.
Nothing so special. But of course, in Japan, also we have many studies about the history from below. Also, some scholars receive very strong influence. The so-called subaltern history studies. So, but these scholars mainly belong to the so-called area studies, Asian area studies field, rather than the mainstream of the historical studies. That is my impression. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
And Hyashim, any thoughts on history from below?
History from below tend to strongly entangle with class conflict ideology, mostly. And once those class system is settled, it tend to be replaced by the history of everyday lives, I believe. So in Korea, at least, those popular or vogue period of history from below is over, and now it moved to history of everyday lives or microhistory.
Okay, thank you. So we have quite a few questions come up in the chat. Unfortunately, I think we can only take one or two. So I'll read this out. We have a question from V. Crompton, and perhaps all the panelists can talk briefly about this. We touched upon it when you spoke earlier. And the question is, what can we do to protect and support academics and historians facing political pressure and even imprisonment?
We signed up and rallied. We stick together, make a statement. In Korea, we do it.
Thank you, Hyashim. So sticking together is important. Anybody else wants to answer that?
I agree with you. For example, I now intensely collaborate with the India scholars, JNU scholars, JN scholars. They are strong, I understand, clearly protest to the government. And my group, I'm the president of the AWH, Asian Association of World Historians. AWH show strong sense of solidarity with JN scholars. And so we are now planning to have the next conference, if possible, in the coming October 2022 at JNU, definitely. That is one example to show our solidarity to the government. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Shigeru. On the note of JNU scholars, Tonika, perhaps you want to share some thoughts. You're unmuted, you're fine. I think you're muted now. Just click it again.
We are very grateful for the wonderful solidarity we received from all across the world, especially from historians, because quite a few of our young history students have been pulled in. And we are aware of that, and we are very, very grateful for that. I think, that has to continue, because the problem is not going to go away. It's going to deepen and strengthen. And if we send out alerts, we send out information, I hope this kind of, you won't get bored with, statements of support for us, for our situation. Apart from that, this is a kind of a begging bowl sort of statement, but our bright students who are working on quote unquote unconventional themes, not necessarily political themes, but themes coming out of new areas of interest, like, as was mentioned just now, themes to do with everyday life. They do not get any kind of research support or jobs nowadays. Jobs are folding up, research assistant is folding up, research institutions are controlled by the government, and now it's kind of drying up. That kind of help. So I would plead for support for young students, would not only, even in ordinary circumstances, they would have benefited greatly from exposure to other universities here and across the world, but more so now.
Thank you. Wonderful points there, making the case for young scholars and their exposure to the world. Very much connected with what we were talking about before in terms of new ways of doing history as well, and global histories. Sandra, any thoughts?
I don't have anything particular to add. In Australia, we have not had the same level of difficulties as other places have. And I agree that sticking together and showing solidarity is the way to go, I think.
Okay, thank you. So we are slightly out of time. There are more questions in the chat, but I think it will take us well beyond time. So I think I'm going to wrap up the session now, and a very big thank you to our panelists, Shigeru Akita, Sandra Wilson, Tonika Shorkar, and Shimsu, for joining us today, for sharing their perspectives of history, and for talking so eloquently about the challenges, but also the opportunities ahead. I think my takeaway from this panel is definitely the fact that we should campaign and support one another, and that we should, in the words of one of our audience members, keep demanding more history and better history, responsible history, to use Professor Shorkar's words. So thank you very much for everybody who's attended the panel. Shigeru, yes, go ahead.
May I finally make short proposal about collaboration?
Of course, you may.
By using the net.
So, of course you may.
yeah. You can see. Yeah.
Yes, we can see your slides.
Yeah, you can see slide.
Yeah. Yeah,
so,
we can see it.
This is a slide, our collaboration with Korean scholars. Suru is the president of the Korean Society of British History. I'm the leader of the Japanese committee of the so-called the East Asian Society of British History. So the 3 years ago, we had first the British East Asian Conference of Historians. We call it BEACH, by the collaboration with several British scholars, including Philip Murphy. And now I would like to continue this kind of the international collaboration, but definitely the center should be the IHR. And we usually start to publish our own journal entitled East Asian Journal of British History. And this is a special issue. And the latest one is volume 7, 2019. And my colleague now editing the volume 8. So this is one example to collaborate furthermore. But for the moment, the collaboration British scholars and with East Asian scholars, but we'd like to broaden this kind of the collaborating network to think and intensively discuss about our interest and common theme. So maybe if possible, next year, 2022, after the great improvement of the COVID-19, we'd like to have the next BEACH second conference, probably in London at IHR. That is our hope. Yeah.
How wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that, Shigeru. And on that call for more collaboration and hopefully a central role at the IHR for everyone.
I have one last.
There's one more. Okay.
Yes, just one last.
That's
comment.
Fine, Shim.
Professor Ludmila Jordanova. Professor Ludmila Jordanova, she is there. We are reading your text next semester. I just want to say.
That's wonderful. That was 2 notes of collaboration then, one from Shigeru and one from Shim, and one with an audience member as well. Wonderful. Okay, thank you so much for everybody for attending this session. It's been a pleasure to talk to you all.